Ole Miss fans, I want to talk to y'all. This is a monumental win for the University of Mississippi. There's no way putting it. It's a program-changing win. It's a program-altering win. You name it, this is it. Because Ole Miss needed this, man. Because I'm not saying this would have happened, but if Ole Miss, last year against Georgia, they got absolutely crushed. And Ole Miss's biggest win before this game was probably 9-3 LSU in 2023, or 7-5 Tennessee in 2021. Like, they've been knocking on the door. And let's face it, let's tell it for what it is. There's an Ohio State tier and there's a Penn State tier. And it's no disrespect to Penn State, but that's what Ole Miss has been, man. They have not been able to win the big game against the elite teams. And all of a sudden, narratives start to play in your head, man, regardless of who you are. And Lane Kiffin could be looking at Florida right now, wherever it may be, and say, hey, you know what? Maybe if they lose this game, maybe we aren't able to beat Georgia. Maybe I can't win the big game here. Maybe I don't have enough of an NIL funding. Maybe there's not a big enough fan base or a big enough recruiting pitch. And Florida has all that. Guess what? Ole Miss just dominated and destroyed the top dog in the sport for these last 3 years. This destroys that narrative. And now Lane Kiffin's looking around saying, you know what? We just destroyed the top dog in the sport. Maybe we can win a national championship. Maybe. Because here's some facts for how freaking big of a win this was for Ole Miss. This is Ole Miss's highest ranked win at home in school history. This is Ole Miss's first top 5 win since Alabama in 2015. I was in 7th grade for that. This is Lane Kiffin's, get this one, folks, first AP top 5 win as a head coach since November 19th, 2011. It's a huge win for them. Also, this is Kirby's first non-Bama loss since the pandemic, November of 2020. So you put it into perspective, this is a unbelievably big win for Ole Miss. Also in the realms of their playoff chances, because all of a sudden their playoff chances that were looking dark and cloudy after they lost to LSU and Kentucky, all that they have to do is potentially run the table now. And boom, they're in. And in terms of the game itself, man, I was impressed with Ole Miss's response, because once Jackson Dart got hurt, turned the ball over, Georgia, bam, 7-0. You're thinking, oh man, is this 2023 Ole Miss Georgia all over again? Is this what it is? It's a good Ole Miss team, but they still can't win the complete game. They still can't win the big game, yada, yada, yada. Narratives rising around. All of a sudden, silenced. Ole Miss dealt with some adversity. And it wasn't perfect. They still averaged 3.7 yards per carry a game, but Ole Miss won in the trenches. Their offensive line was ready, which has not been a thing for Ole Miss in the big game. Let's be real. I mean, Dart was under duress so much last year against Georgia, and I'm going to get into how much he was against LSU and against Kentucky this year. Arguably, you could say it cost him the game. It's the reason they have 2 losses. Look, man, I'm going to say this too. Against Kentucky, 5 sacks allowed for Ole Miss. Against LSU, Ole Miss gave up 6 sacks. Against Georgia, 1 sack. You want to know what won them the game? That. Right there. Because in the past, man, I mentioned it, Ole Miss would be great on the outside. They would have these awesome receivers and this electric offense. But in the end of the day, in the SEC, football's a freaking war, man. And if you don't have the dudes in the trenches, like Ole Miss hasn't had, it doesn't matter who you have on the outside. You ain't going to win. And that has been proven. Ole Miss has those dudes now. They're here to stay. And I'm going to say a bold claim here. If Michigan can win a championship, so can Ole Miss. Ole Miss, Michigan saying, oh man, they're not talented enough. They have good dudes, they have good players, but they don't have that great absolute next level that Ohio State has or that Georgia has. BS. Michigan won the championship. They crushed nearly every opponent that they've played, and they were 14th in talent composite. They weren't oozing with 4 and 5 stars across the board. They had a great coach with a really experienced team who did what he could do to absolutely get the most out of his resources. And you know what? That's what Lane Kiffin is really freaking good at. Michigan 14th in talent composite last year. Ole Miss 19th in the Triple H model. Not necessarily oozing talent. Michigan was one of the most experienced teams in college football last year. Ole Miss is the second most this year. And look, man, what's different? You're asking me, okay, Harris, why are you saying these claims? What's different from this Ole Miss team? In 2021, Ole Miss gave up, I have it right here, 25.3 points allowed per game, 49th. They were 49th, 63, 40, and 42nd the last 4 years in points allowed in defense. You know what they are? Sixth. This is not your traditional score a bunch of points and give up a little bit less than you scored type team that we're used to seeing with Ole Miss. They're giving up 14 points per game this year. Their front seven won them this game against Georgia. They forced 4 fumbles, all the deflections that led to interceptions. They got to Carson Beck 5 times. They had 9 tackles for loss in the backfield, and another underrated stat. Ole Miss is allowing 2.4 yards per carry on the season. You know that's the least in the FBS. They have the number 1 rush defense in the country, folks. Like, this is a great SEC front seven, which is something that Kiffin probably hasn't had. Ole Miss gave up 1.8 yards per carry on the game against Georgia. And in the past, you know what Georgia did to Ole Miss last year? 35 carries, 300 yards, 9 yards per carry, 5 rushing touchdowns on Ole Miss last year. Ran all over them like a train, like a Ford F-150, folks. Like, they demolished them in the trenches. Ole Miss this year, Kiffin said, all right, we're going to retool and we're going to rebuild. And I'm going to fix those woes in the portal. And you know what? He did. Because this Ole Miss team is different. This is not the team that we saw last year that is going to the Cotton Bowl. This is not your type of team who's going to flop in the big game. They're here to stay. And this is an unbelievable win for Ole Miss. I cannot state it enough. If you're an Ole Miss fan, you were getting a little bit nervous because if Kiffin loses, all of a sudden you're telling yourself, shoot, man, these narratives might be true. Regardless of how logical, illogical it is, the human brain itself, sometimes when we lose, when we're down, we can start to believe it. We can. And, frick, man, could have been happening. But you know what? They won the big game, and Ole Miss did it. And all of a sudden, their playoff chances last week probably went from 30% to about 90%, 80%, around there. Big win for Ole Miss, not just for the sake of the playoff, not just for the sake of saving their season, but for the sake of saying to those other SEC schools, we are here to stay. For the last probably 20 years, in my lifetime, Mississippi has been a pipeline state because there's a lot of football talent in Mississippi. It's one of the lineman capitals of America, by the way. There's a lot of big guys in the trenches that come from the state of Mississippi. It has been a pipeline for Alabama, for LSU, for Georgia, for Tennessee, for Florida to come in there and poach that talent. All of a sudden, Ole Miss can say, hey, no, you can come win a national championship here. And that's what they're doing. Props to Lane Kiffin on this one, man, because that is an unbelievably big win. Can't state it enough.